Hi, everybody. I'm hoping everybody's still awake at the last session. I have an exciting talk around APIs, so hopefully we can get through it and get to some exciting questions that you guys might have. So, welcome. I'm going to be talking about Neo4j and really expanding Neo4j into the .NET ecosystem. And I'm going to show you how we're essentially doing that and using a library called HotChocolate to essentially do that. So the .NET ecosystem really doesn't have a lot of tooling built around other than just a driver. And this library that we've been working on over the past year really tries to solve the issue of not having to hop around to either Java or to JavaScript, and the .NET developers can use Neo4j, and then also talk a little bit about GraphQL as a way to connect your API to apps. So that's going to be the talk. My name is Arif Hanif. I work for Affiliated Engineers, and we are, I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm a licensed mechanical engineer, and graphs are really a way in our industry, in the construction industry, to really get through some of the bottlenecks that we've have. And so utilizing some of the capabilities inside of Neo4j and the property graphs is really something that our company is starting to look at. So just a bit of background about Affiliated Engineers. It's a consulting services for the building environments. And we specifically work in complicated lab and healthcare environments. And we have about 700 plus engineers throughout the country. And just providing engineering excellence is our business, and trying to utilize data the best we can to do that. So we've been working on building applications internally to share with our engineers to use on a day-to-day basis. And we started to work, a lot of our data was relational, and started to work in SQL. We had a lot of developers in the .NET area. And as we started to expand into graph databases, we ran into this issue of a lack of knowledge of either in JavaScript or Java, and trying to use the core team that is .NET developers to be able to still continue to work and utilize some of the capabilities inside of Neo4j. So we were already building around GraphQL, and I'll give a little bit of an overview of GraphQL and exactly how this library came about. So for the people that don't know anything about GraphQL, it's the first time you're hearing that term, but if you've attended any of the previous nodes, William at Neo4j, and I have a slide. There's quite a bit of talks on GraphQL that you can kind of learn and dive more into. But it's really a query language, an API query language, and a runtime to build APIs. So if you've ever built APIs before, the natural progression's been using REST APIs, where you've got multiple endpoints, and you just have a bunch of data that that comes with those endpoints, and you get what you get. But with GraphQL, the focus really is there is a schema and a graph, and how you query that. You have one request, one endpoint. There's kind of no over or under fetching, and I'll show examples of that. There's a type system, and it's predictable, and it's really been taking off in kind of the API arena. Facebook introduced this. It's something that they used and opened up a spec, and the community has really utilized it well. And Neo4j actually has a library that they're building around GraphQL with JavaScript as well. And this is really going to focus on the .NET area. So what the Neo4j GraphQL ecosystem at the moment, as of this talk, I can actually add to this, but at the moment, there's a library from in JavaScript, there's one in Java, and the new kid on the block, HotChocolate, which we'll be talking about today. So as I spoke a little bit about it, there are a bunch of presentations at Nodes. If you get a chance to watch the recaps or the YouTube videos, please check out Daryl or Daniel's and Williams' talk that really gets into how some of the JavaScript library from Neo4j is being used as well. And then we're trying to make essentially an equivalent in .NET for .NET developers. So really the goal is to make your entire application stack a graph. Neo4j has an amazing platform that they've been building around their data integrations, their tooling, and their drivers and APIs. But it really, as you start to connect to some of these other languages, um, uh, GraphQL can be actually a really good way for people that are not so familiar with Cypher and want to essentially get in with low code approaches and really get into the Neo4j system. And that's really what the talk today is about. The entire platform that there's a set of core developers that are working on HotChocolate at the moment, and there's a company around that called Chili Cream, and they're essentially looking to provide essentially connections to databases, hosting, management of DevOps, and client and API connections. So this was really something that we sought after working at Affiliate Engineers. We had a bunch of SQL data and Mongo data, and we didn't want to really go and learn another framework to essentially integrate Neo4j. And I'll walk you guys through what we came up with. So the goals for the Neo4j integration with HotChocolate were to really reduce boilerplate. If you just have a driver and a bunch of controllers and endpoints, it's a lot of work to go and set up queries and mutations and get data from Cypher, just writing Cypher manually. And so we wanted to really reduce that boilerplate, increase the developer productivity, make it extensible, have it work in different languages. It had to be performant, yeah, as well as you wanted to be able to essentially convert a GraphQL query into a single Cypher query, and really focus on the area of low code and getting into pro code. So somebody without a lot of knowledge of Cypher or GraphQL could pick this up and start to utilize it, and then add more advanced capabilities as needed. So under the hood, just before we get in, and I'm going to really show a demo of what's going on, is under the hood you have a GraphQL query, and a GraphQL query is just a specification of what do you want from the server. So instead of hitting an endpoint, you really say, okay, there are these types that I have. I might have a person type or a movie or some sort of data that I'm after, and then I can apply filtering and sorting and projections and things like that on top of that query. So if I have a person's and I'm searching for somebody, the front end can essentially ask for this information. And I don't necessarily need to know how to convert that into Cypher. I can just expose that through a type definition, and the library, the middleware layer, just knows how to convert that into a tree and convert that into Cypher. And that's really what the HotChocolate library does, is convert the incoming query into the AST and convert it into a single Cypher statement that the database can execute, and then essentially return a response back to the server. And so what we really found useful with the HotChocolate library versus using the out-of-built one that Neo4j provides is this is also built for SQL. It does the same thing, and for MongoDB for JSON, because you're never just working in just a property graph, or you have SQL data, relational, you have document-based data, and you want to try to merge all that together. And you have different databases that your enterprise owns. And so this library really tries to hit and provide access to all of that rich ecosystem that's kind of available. So I'm going to get into the demo of the GraphQL API and how do you actually set this up in .NET. First one is going to bring over .NET. So the first thing that to get started with working in this environment, if you've ever used GraphQL, is you essentially have type definitions. And with type definitions, you essentially specify, if you've worked with an object-oriented programming language, You specify your classes, and your types are essentially your classes. So a movie, an actor, and this is the example schema that I'm going to show with this library, and you can expand on it. And what makes this really easy to work with is you can essentially specify your entire schema this way, complicated schemas, and we have a bit of a roadmap that I'll show at the end. But you can specify, you have a movie and it has a title, and there are different scalars that can essentially be assigned to that. And then you go ahead and specify your relationships with these directives, and you can essentially set up your entire schema this way in this file in the type definition. So you can go ahead and actually define a type definitions.graphql and set up this schema this way, and this library will actually generate the GraphQL schema for you that allows you to filter and have some rich API querying capability built into it. So you can go ahead and specify this type definitions.graphql. There's this GraphQL JSON library, and I'm going to share the link to this repository so people can try this out. And this essentially allows you to specify, you can have multiple files. I'm showing a very rudimentary example here to get people introduced to this idea, but you can have multiple GraphQL files if you want to break up your schema. And essentially, this library will search through your repository folder for all of the .graphql files and essentially combine that together. And then there are extensions around the different databases. So this is an example of Neo4j. We're working on libraries for MongoDB and SQL to define it exactly this way so that you can set up this API. Doesn't matter if it's Cypher, Mongo, or SQL. You can essentially set up schemas through this type definition file, get used to working and kind of creating a contract between your front end and your back end, and essentially setting up your GraphQL schema that I will show in a second. So you have the setup or the GraphQL JSON, the type definition, and then for .NET developers, you essentially need to connect to the database somehow. So that's essentially where the .NET driver comes in. This is produced by Neo4j and the Neo4j drivers team. And you can essentially load the Neo4j driver in. And this format that I'm showing you is actually with .NET 6. They've essentially introduced what are called top-level programs. And instead of having a main area, you can actually just spin up a API server with this very lean code, kind of like what you see in JavaScript. So if you've used the Neo4j GraphQL library, this library is trying to mimic exactly that in the .NET ecosystem. So you have a driver, and this is it can either be the Bolt address and then the authentication. I have a dummy database that I've spun up for this example. And this is essentially what you need to connect. And so what's happening in the background is the library actually goes through that schema type definition file that you have and uses a feature of C# and .NET called source generators to actually take all of that, turn it into a tree, and compile that GraphQL schema for you. So really approaching that like low code, being able to spin up an API that is rich, has a query language that I will show very, very quickly by just defining a contract, putting a signature of a driver, and exposing this. So I have this API running right now, and I will bring up the client that's actually built into HotChocolate. There are different flavors of what is called a GraphQL IDE for people that have used this, or if you haven't, it's essentially built into a lot of frameworks. If you've seen things like Apollo and a couple of others. There are different flavors of this IDE. This is one that's actually built by the HotChocolate team, and it's built directly in. So with this code and adding this app.map GraphQL, it essentially launches a GraphQL server at your local host 5001, and there you can go beyond this. I won't include that in this talk because 30 minutes is a short amount of time, but there are a lot of configurations for the server to expand on this. And I will talk about the documentations and kind of the community near the end of the presentation. So by spinning up this server, you get the schema essentially being exposed as a GraphQL API. And before I go ahead and show some of the queries, a way to essentially the beauty of GraphQL as well is the API is self-documenting, and you can expose this to users and kind of control, provide a login system around this. But at the moment, it's just exposed, at the public address. So if this API was exposed at localhost 5000/GraphQL, you get this interface that essentially introspects that schema and provides this interface that has documentation built in and actually a way to query the API around that. So what you can do is actually go in and see what does the API allow me to do in this environment. So in that schema, if you saw in the type definitions, I had a type called movie and a type called actors, or a type called actor, and the library essentially infers a lot of information and goes ahead and sets up a schema for you. The beauty about the HotChocolate library too is you can fully dive into the .NET environment and start to customize things, like if you want to change the name of these queries, what the type definitions are, how the scalars essentially work. But what we wanted to be able to do was essentially, with not a lot of knowledge, you could go and put a type definition file together and spin up a GraphQL schema like the JavaScript environment allowed you to do, but then also go full in and control what you needed to do. So, and in here, you can click on these types under movies or actors, and then it's self-documenting, where I use that term, but you can see what fields are essentially exposed, and you can traverse relationships on that and see how that graph is essentially set up. So that's essentially what GraphQL allows you to do. Is it has a type system built into it and a lot of tooling that makes developing a lot easier from the front end to the back end. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to actually utilizing some of this. So I can come into this. I'll go ahead and close this document up real quick and come in here. And so this is the environment where I can actually ask the API for data. And I've loaded in an example data set. So one thing that I wanted to point out, if people haven't used GraphQL before, is a lot of the IDEs have IntelliSense built into them, and Banana Cake Pop, which is this IDE as well, has that built in. So you can, instead of going to the documentation, you can use the IntelliSense and go ahead and request that information. So with GraphQL, you essentially have it's like a JSON type structure, but it's just the keys of that JSON. And so instead of having endpoints, you have one endpoint, and you let the client, which could be a React application, Vue, whatever you're essentially using. There's a lot of great libraries for front-end clients to essentially connect to these GraphQL APIs. The ecosystem has really been growing. And so you can go ahead and execute that query. And you can see I've loaded in, I have a Neo4j desktop instance running in the background and loaded in some of that data. And you can get into mutations and queries, and that won't be a heavy focus for me today. But essentially, the library allows you to work with Neo4j, same way it allows to work with SQL and Mongo, and really turn your property graph into an API that can be exposed. So I'm going to go and show some of the other capabilities of using GraphQL this way. And so a lot of people sometimes they can pick up Cypher very quickly, but it's still another skill set that you have to pick up. And what this library allows you to do is essentially abstract away or abstract on top of Cypher and the AST just the GraphQL language. And if you know how to query GraphQL, it knows how to write that Cypher statement at the end of the day. So we can go in here and start to do a bit smarter things, like if I want title to have contains reloaded, for example, I can go ahead and execute that query. Yeah, I made a mistake here. One sec. Let's go back and title.contains, and it should be like this, not this curly braces. So I can go ahead and query that information and run that, and that Cypher essentially is executing that Cypher in the background and returning the results back to you. So I'll just go ahead and go over to the schema and just if you want to learn more about the filtering capability that's available, you can go ahead and click on movies, and if you have the movie type, if you bring this open, this has the filtering and ordering of the API built into it. So you can click on the filter type, and it allows you to say, okay, I have titles, and there's string operations, and there's things that I can essentially execute against that. So contains, doesn't contain, starts with, ends with, all of that rich API querying is now available, same way it is with sorting. So that's essentially the library. I will go ahead and come back. So a lot of things have been worked on. This library is still in preview, and we're looking for feedback. And I will provide a slide on how you can essentially provide some of that feedback. So some of the resources that are available. Go ahead and share this again. Okay, so some of the resources that are available, you can go to the documentation at HotChocolate.io, and I'll bring that up in a second. There's also a Slack community. There's about 2,000 users that are using HotChocolate, and pretty significant amount of companies have started to build around this .NET library because it's very performant, gives you a GraphQL API, has access to multiple kind of database frameworks, and it's growing daily in some of the integrations that are being built around that. You can visit the HotChocolate repository and have a look at that and the source code around that. It's all open source. And then the example that I presented today, it's actually available in the same company repository at GraphQL Workshop for Neo4j. So that you should be able to go into, and if you have .NET SDK installed and you have Visual Studio Code, you can just do .NET run, and it will build that library, and you'll be able to see that environment and mess around with it. The only thing that you won't have is the data loaded, and we're trying to add to that tutorial just to make sure that people can get in and kind of test out and provide some of the feedback capability as well. So there's a lot already there in terms of filtering and sorting and all of that, but we really want to improve the ecosystem a lot more for .NET. And some of the things that we're working towards right now to really get into this ecosystem is an object graph mapper. And this is something that the Neo4j team has worked on in the JavaScript area. So allowing you to do things like find, delete, get in the .NET in C#, really allowing you to do that. Another thing that we're working on, and I've actually started to work on this already, is the Cypher parser. So this allows you to essentially just take like a magic string of Cypher and turn it into the AST that the library is using. So a lot of this right now is using like a visitor pattern to traverse the GraphQL graph and turn it into the Cypher language. And we want to be able to essentially inject raw Cypher statements. So you can define a field and say, this is the Cypher statement that I want to execute that allows you to do more complicated searches like PageRank or similarities and things like that. And so really trying to expose some of the rich features of Neo4j inside of the library. And then add things like cursor pagination that really, you don't want to return 2 billion records to the user. So at the moment, if you tried to run this against a production database, it's really not there just yet. And so some of these features that we're looking to add and try to get into the library by August really allow you to go from a type definition file very quickly to a full-blown GraphQL API that has some rich capability with the @Cypher directive. And then beyond that, there are a couple other things that we've looked at that we really needed at Affiliate Engineers that this library will help, kind of reduce development time, is to auto-generate CRUD mutations and live subscriptions. So in that area, having the ability to create a node, update a node and delete a node, we want to reduce that boilerplate as well and just allow you to go and say, I have this type and I want to expose how to write it in GraphQL, and I can work between the different databases. And then later on in the year, we have plans around aggregation and spatial data. So that is another piece that the building construction industry needs a lot of an aggregation and spatial context with GraphQL. So that is something that we'll be working on in this library. And there's about 3 core contributors that are kind of working on the Neo4j area. But if you come into the Slack community, you'll see that there's a lot of people, because it's a fully open source project. There's a lot of people working on documentation and really pushing this library forward. And at the bottom, there is a roadmap. There is actually a roadmap in GitHub. You can kind of come check out exactly this in a kind of a Kanban board. So in conclusion, if you're interested in finding out more, join the Slack community. You can grab it from this PowerPoint deck, and there's a Neo4j channel in there. And we'd love for you to test out the integration and provide your feedback on GitHub. And if you like the project, please give it a star. We want to push the .NET area to really have people come into and use Neo4j. I think it's a great product, and using property graphs really extend your capability of what type of applications that you can essentially produce. With that, I wanted to thank everybody for sticking to the very end and the last presentation of the day. And I hope you got something out of it. Thank you.